Okay, great. Let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Nasia, and welcome to the Clinical Trials Community of Practice. Today, we are very excited to share three amazing speakers for you. Dr. Shellie Ellis is Professor of Hematology, Oncology, and Palliative Care. She's a health services researcher and implementation scientist. Her research focuses on identifying and testing strategies to translate evidence-based practice into rural and non-rural clinical settings. She leads the Implementation Impact Lab, serves as Associate Director for Implementation Science at ICTR, and leads the ICTR Dissemination and Implementation Launchpad. We also have Dr. Felice Resnik, who is the lead research scientist in the Dissemination and Implementation Launchpad at ICTR, where she focuses on advancing effective practices for disseminating and implementing evidence-based interventions. She regularly consults with and educates researchers and learners across campus to support meaningful application of D&I concepts in their work. We also have Dr. Jonah K. Amponsah. He's a statistician in the Implementation Impact Lab, part of the UW-Carbone Cancer Center, where he applies his training in biostatistics and data science to oncology-focused survey analysis, evaluation data management, and mixed methods research. He collaborates with the Dissemination and Implementation Launchpad to develop reproducible analytic workflows, contributes to manuscripts, and provides quantitative support for emerging implementation strategy trials. We are so lucky to have this trio with us today, and I will hand it over to Dr. Ellis. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for having us here. We're excited to be in this forum and to talk about study design considerations for implementation research. This is an area that we are developing and invite you to contribute to. And we are this is sort of our first foray into talking about this in a more formalized way, and we're planning multiple things, including a future short course from the Dissemination and Implementation Launchpad around clinical trial, advanced trial designs for implementation science. So we definitely invite you to help us develop these ideas. So today we're going to talk about, and I hope I convince you of the importance of trials in implementation research, which maybe some folks are not used to talking about. We'll talk about some D&I trial designs and try to give some examples of those designs, and then bring up a few special considerations that we've run into when thinking about trials within the implementation science context. And then Felice is going to provide you with some resources if this is something that you're working on that might help you. And we hope to leave time for discussion and questions. So I'll first make the case for implementation science if this is not something you're familiar with. So when we have a healthcare intervention that is 100% efficacious, if it works for every patient in every situation and is completely effective, if that intervention is never used, it is actually 0% effective. So implementation science is all about making sure that the interventions and innovations that get developed are actually used in practice and not just in academic practice, but in all community practice. We know that this does not always happen, that the thing that we know to be the best thing to prescribe to our patients or to use with our patients is the thing that we actually do. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that it takes a long time for innovations to actually reach practice, and that not everything that we identify actually gets there and to benefit the patients for whom they're intended. And when we ask providers if they go out and look for evidence-based research, the answer is really no. So there is a need to actually do things, intervene upon clinicians, healthcare practices, and health systems to actually help them find the evidence, bring it to their attention, figure out ways that they can actually use it, and then accelerate that process. And that is implementation science, which is the study and practice of how to actually get things implemented. It's about understanding how to apply implementation strategies, processes, and approaches to support the people who are delivering care, to make change and achieve the health outcomes that the innovations are designed to address. Implementation science helps us to know how to implement more effectively. And I always say that implementation science is a brand new field, but I'm getting older and the field is maturing. And so we're not really a brand new field anymore. It's relatively new. And so there's still a lot we need to learn and figure out. But we are based on a lot of other established disciplines, health economics, uh, sociology, anthropology, psychology, and so we build our methods around things that are established, but we still have a lot to learn. That said, our friends at the University of Michigan have pointed out that we really are a maturing field and we're ready for our second evolutionary leap. It's not enough to just describe barriers and facilitators to test to getting those practice gaps that I mentioned filled. We're really at a point where we need to specify and test optimal strategies for implementation. And so we're really shifting, and that shifts the methods that we use in implementation science. So this is my very comprehensive assessment of the methods that we use in dissemination and implementation research. And many of you might be most familiar with implementation scientists using qualitative methods, really deep, rich exploration of why people don't do what's evidence-based. And that's an important part of implementation science, but that's not where we need to be heading. So that's an important thing that we do, and we need to do in practice to make sure we really understand what the barriers are and to match implementation strategies to address those barriers more effectively. But there are lots of other, not just qualitative methods, but quantitative methods that we use in implementation science and need to develop further. So looking at the right side of this chart, there are certainly different things that we do to assess how good our interventions are and how well they can be adopted in practice. Also methodologies to assess the effectiveness of the implementation strategies we use. And then in an even more advanced way, thinking about how we optimize implementation strategies. And we'll talk about these different buckets. But I hope I convince you that qualitative assessment of barriers and facilitators of evidence-based practice is just the beginning, and there's a lot more to implementation science. So that said, implementation scientists often have little training as trialists. So some of those methodologies that were on the right side of that graph are less familiar to us. So I'll use myself as an example. I trained my master's degree is in anthropology. I spent a long time getting that degree, understanding qualitative methods and observational methods to really get deep understanding of phenomenon and particularly medical practice. My doctoral degree is in health policy and management, which focuses on using econometric methods to understand and observe data in the real world. And so I had very little training in my development as an implementation scientist as a trialist. Was fortunate to spend some time in a academic medical center that did a great job conducting clinical trials and got to observe some things, but that's not typical of implementation scientists. And so when we assess the needs of our D&I network last fall, we noticed similar things. Even though UW has a great reputation for doing implementation science, we're a very mature network of implementation scientists with some of the groundbreaking work happening here at UW. There's still some gaps. And you can see on this chart, beginners on the left, advanced providers on the implementation scientists on the right. But still, the area where there's gap, need for understanding and using methodologies versus the experience that people have in these methodologies. The orange bars suggest where we need to expand what we're offering, both from the launch pad, but as an institution as well, to keep up with what's going on in cutting edge implementation science. So the things that our network of implementation scientists identified as things we need help with are really the trial methodologies. Pragmatic trials, cluster randomized trials, hybrid effectiveness implementation designs, stepped wedge studies, sequential multiple assignment randomized trials, or SMART, and multi-phase optimization strategies, or known as MOST. So those are the kinds of things that we need to develop to keep up with our field. And we're looking for help from the trialists to help us understand how to design these kinds of studies since we weren't necessarily trained in them. So, when I think about these different implementation trials that we need to work on, I think about them in three buckets. And so, one set of trials I think about as extending intervention reach. So, thinking about a healthcare intervention or innovation that we want to make sure is, as we design it and create it, is as applicable to as many people as possible and will be adopted, because it's the next best thing to sliced bread. So we want to create sliced bread that everybody just automatically needs and wants. And so that's the kind of trials that I think about when I think about intervention reach to help us get to that point. Um, when we have innovations that aren't quite sliced bread and they need help to get into practice, then we think about trials that help us understand implementation strategies. And so those are the things that help those innovations get further out into wide scale use. The third bucket of things I like to think about are implementation strategy optimization. So once we understand what strategies work to help move innovations out into practice, they might work, but maybe we can optimize those and make them even more effective. So there are buckets of trial methodologies that I think about in those realms. These are not hard and fast, but it's just a categorization that is sort of helpful for me to think about some of the issues that come up in these kinds of trials and where they might apply and where they might not apply. So thinking about the first bucket of focusing on an intervention itself and figuring out how to get its widest reach. Basically, what we really want to do is increase the generalizability of those kinds of trials. And so that's where pragmatic trials come in. So what we want to do is conduct trials in real world settings. And we use those because we want the results to be more generalizable. We want them to be beyond, the academic setting. We want them to be generalizable beyond just understanding in ideal conditions what works. We want to know what happens when you take this intervention and you put it in rural Wisconsin and ask regular healthcare providers to give it to their regular patients. And what we might find is that it's no longer effective because there are a lot of things that go on in real world practice that don't happen in ideal conditions. Different patients, different delivery intensity, lots of things are different. And so what we really want to know is what's going to work in those conditions. And, how is this different from a regular clinical trial? Well, we're asking really different questions. In a clinical trial, we're thinking about, does this thing work to affect health outcomes? When we're thinking about a pragmatic trial, that's not really the question. We're thinking about, does this work in this setting, and can we inform policy and practice by the results of this trial? Been involved in pragmatic trials. I can give examples of, bundling different evidence-based practices to address hypertension, and, trying to figure out if we can make this work in real-world settings. And I'll talk a little bit about that. There are ways to assess how pragmatic a trial is. And I'll show you the graph on the right is an example of that. So thinking about different aspects of trial design and what we're concerned about. And we can grade eligibility criteria or the outcomes that we assess on how pragmatic they are in real world settings. And so that's something that we think about in the pragmatic trial setting. Another thing that comes about when thinking about how we get the widest reach for interventions are something that we talk about in implementation science and gets quite confusing among us and among when we're talking across in transdisciplinary settings. So hybrid implementation effectiveness designs, and I put designs in quotation marks because we're not really talking about study designs. We're really talking about an approach to thinking about implementation effectiveness. And we have this, it's an approach with 3 studies in a single, typically NIH grant. So the whole idea of hybrid implementation effectiveness designs is thinking about how do we smush what we need to do in implementation science into the typical NIH model, which is a 3-aim study. So what you see in a typical type 1 effectiveness implementation trial is what we would see in a normal NIH kind of designed clinical trial. So the primary or the first aim is really thinking about effectiveness and prioritizing a primary outcome that we want to base power calculations around. And it's typically the design of the actual study that we used to study this is often a randomized trial, but it can be any kind of trial. It could be a quasi-experimental study. It could be other kinds of designs, but this is what we typically think about when thinking about the normal model. Like other clinical trials, AIM 2 is often just built off of that randomized trial and thinking about a comparison of secondary outcomes. And then AIM 3 is where we often think about implementation. So we might think about the provider, staff, and administrators' perceptions of the intervention and its implementation, but really prioritize that and definitely include that in these kinds of studies, because that's what we want to figure out is when we're doing this clinical trial, what are we finding out about how difficult it is to actually do the intervention, and what can we do to potentially change that so that when we move this out into a wider scale or wider settings, how we can improve upon how we deliver this. The example from the VCCC study that looked at hypertension, our primary AIM 1, this was a hybrid implementation effectiveness trial type 1, and so our primary or first aim was to do this pragmatic trial of hypertension control, which was our primary outcome. Our second aim was to look at secondary outcomes, changes in cognitive function, other cardiovascular disease risk and events, and health resource utilization in this study. Then in our third aim, we're actually concerned about implementation outcomes. And so we assessed feasibility, acceptability, and appropriateness of the different components of this intervention we developed, a bundled intervention to address hypertension, bypassing physicians mostly. And then we looked at other things like intention to adopt once the study was over, and did that qualitative assessment of barriers and facilitators to understand how we needed to tweak the intervention for rollout post the trial. So the other thing you'll hear about is different types of these hybrid designs, quote unquote. And they range from what I just described, where the primary aim is really thinking about the effectiveness of the intervention, to a type 3 study, which looks at and often compares different implementation strategies and is really focused on looking at the effectiveness of the implementation strategies as the primary outcome. So very different kind of design. The next bucket of trials I like to think about are implementation strategy effectiveness trials. So if we're thinking about the type 3 hybrid designs, but also just studies where we're not really thinking about the NIH model, but designing actual study designs to test implementation strategies. And often what we're doing is instead of intervening at the individual level, uh, at the patient level, for example, we're intervening at a group level. So while we're still interested in the patient outcomes and we're analyzing patient outcomes, what we're doing is delivering an intervention either to providers, practices, or sometimes even health systems. And so we're randomizing units at the group level, but we still may be understanding our outcome at the individual level. And so this introduces new things that we need to think about. So, for example, cluster randomized trials, where you have to account for this fact that patients are clustered within providers or clinics or potentially health systems, or maybe at multiple of those levels. Some examples, one of the first translation of research into practice studies that NHLBI funded, I was fortunate to be involved in. And what we did is we were looking at cholesterol guideline adherence and providing some interventions that would help providers in primary care actually adhere to those cholesterol guidelines called ATP3 at the time. We were intervening at the practice level because we couldn't randomize different physicians because they might share what they were doing and their tools with other physicians in the practice. So we randomized at the practice level, and then we had an attention control that was looking at getting similar educational activity and attention to their practice, but focusing on blood pressure control instead. So again, we were measuring our outcomes at the individual patient level, or changes in their cholesterol and cholesterol management through this. So I'm going to let Felice talk a little bit about step wedge designs, which is another thing that we're often using in implementation science.
Thank you. A stepped wedge trial is a type of study design where all the clusters, such as like individual clinics or different providers, start in the control condition. And then over time, they transition to the intervention according to a randomized staggered schedule. And so instead of switching all the clusters at once, the rollout happens in phases across multiple time periods. And part of the stepped wedge is that it kind of looks like steps when you're trying to transition across the different ones. So there are several advantages to using a stepped wedge design. So first, every cluster eventually receives the intervention. So there's no cluster that only gets the control, which can be really important when the intervention is expected to be beneficial or when withholding it would be impractical or unethical. Another strength is that it's often has a lot of real world feasibility. So in some cases, it can be really challenging to roll out the intervention to all participants at the same time. There can be limitations around staffing or education or getting everyone onboarded to the intervention all at once. So it allows for some real world feasibility. Additionally, stepped wedge trials often offer statistical advantages. And for one thing, each cluster can act as its own control. Also, because clusters are measured repeatedly over time, the design allows for both within cluster and between cluster comparisons. And so these repeated measure structures often lead to increased statistical power, which can make it easier to detect the intervention effects, even while the number of clusters may be limited. So next slide. I want to give an example of a project I was a part of that used a step wedge design. This was done in collaboration with a team of UW and UW Health collaborators, including Dr. Mary Ryan Bauman, who's our statistician who I see on this call. And it was a pragmatic randomized controlled trial evaluating whether ambient AI documentation tools could improve health practitioner well-being. So clinician burnout is a major concern, and one of the key contributors is documentation burden. Ambient AI tools assist with real-time documentation, and it was hypothesized that by using this tool, it would help reduce the cognitive load and improve well-being. This had been being used and implemented across health systems nationwide, but there were no rigorous trials of it, so the evidence of it was quite limited. Our study tested the impact of the system as it was rolled out into routine care at UW Health. We used the step wedge clustered randomized trial design. So all groups eventually received the intervention, but they transitioned from control to intervention at that different time point. And you can see from the figure kind of the different steps when each one was rolled into the phase of the intervention. And this figure was nicely created by Dr. Mary Ryan Bauman, who is on this call. What was helpful about the step wedge design is it allowed us to evaluate the system's effects while still preserving randomization and strong internal validity, because all groups were kind of able to receive the intervention, but they were at different time points. Some unique challenges we faced relate to implementation fidelity, which can be important to consider in step wedge designs because the intervention unfolds over an extended period of time, so lots of changes can happen. So for examples, as clusters adopt the system, there can be informal learning, or so unexposed teams may begin to change their behavior early, or they may not think they need the education because they've heard from other practitioners about how easy the tool is. There can be things like software changes that can impact fidelity. But at the same time, all these fidelity issues are interwoven with time, which highlights why randomization is so important so that it can be accounted for in the analysis. Thank you. If you have more questions about the study, myself or Dr. Mary Ryan Bauman could also answer those as well.
So the next bucket of trials that we like to think about in implementation science are really when once we have perhaps stumbled upon or intentionally figured out a strategy, an implementation strategy that's effective, we might want to make sure that it's optimally effective. Maybe we're doing audit and feedback, and we don't know exactly which parts of audit and feedback are most important. Is it the audit? Is it the feedback? How we do the feedback? So we might want to think about how we make sure that that strategy is as effective as it possibly can be. And so then we might think about implementation strategy optimization. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jonah to talk about a few of those designs.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk about multi-phase optimization strategy, which is also known as MOST. And MOST is actually inspired by Linda Collins and colleagues. What they did was to have a framework that will help them to optimize and develop multi-component behavioral and medical interventions. So most people usually see MOST as a design, but MOST actually is a framework. It's not a design. And since it's a framework, it can vary from one study to another study. In other words, it doesn't follow one pattern, like this is how we do it, this is how it should be done. But because it's a framework, it usually vary from one study to another study. And the aim of MOST, why Linda and co-developed MOST, is to optimize the component interventions. So what they actually did was, if there are so many interventions you want to consider in your study, what is the best way to select those candidates, like those components? Which of them is actually better for your study without using all the components available? And when I talk about components, is there any aspect of the intervention that you can separate out from your study? In other words, your ingredients, those that you are using in your study. If you can take any of the component out, if you can take any out, that is known as your component. And the aim of MOST is to, among all the components, which one should you consider? Because sometimes we have a lot of interventions available, and due to lack of funding, due to time constraint, due to budget and other stuff, you don't want to consider all the interventions. You want to find a way of selecting the optimal interventions to use in your study. In so doing, they develop what's known as the three phases of most. The first phase talks about the preparation, how you are going to identify your components. The next phase talks about your optimization, how to test the component that you selected. And then finally, they talk about evaluation, how you are going to evaluate the optimized intervention. So when you look at the diagram on the next slide, it tells you how most is being constructed. So the first phase of most is what's known as the preparation phase. So during the preparation phase, this is where you have your conceptual model or your uh, blueprint, which you can use your pilot study. So if things don't go well, you come back to preparation phase to modify it. And during the during the preparation phase, that's the time for you to select your best candidate interventions. Let's say you have about 10 interventions. This is the stage for you to select your best candidate interventions. Maybe you can select 3 or 4. So that's the preparation stage. So the preparation stage is just like having your conceptual model, how you identify your best candidate to use. Then after selecting your best candidate, what you need to do is to find a way of optimizing those candidates. That's the optimization criterion. So here you define what you want to use to determine those best candidates, how you can optimize them to select those ones. So in so doing, after you try to get your optimization criterion, which depends on your study. If your optimization criteria is about, it's about finance or budget, then you know that, okay, I don't want to select all my components. Maybe let me select 2 components or 2 interventions because we don't have enough budget. So that could be your optimization criteria. And from the preparation stage, the next step is to move on to the optimization stage. So during the optimization stage, that's the stage where you identify the best candidates that meets your optimization criterion. So in the preparation phase, you have your candidates, you select your optimization criterion. Then in the optimization stage, based on the criterion, you are going to find a study that will help you to optimize them. One of the studies people mostly use during the optimization stage is the factorial design. So most people always see most as a factorial design because that's what actually people use all the time. But in the optimization stages, there are other designs you can use. One of them is the smart design. You can also use adaptive design, which I'll talk about in my next slide. So in case your aim is to just screen components, just to select the best components, then usually people prefer using the factorial design. And in factorial design, either use a complete factorial design or use a fractional factorial design. Fractional factorial design means that you don't want to, even though you have selected 6 components, still you don't use a 6 component. You want to use a subset of it. But in factorial design, you consider all the levels, all the components in that. So that is the factorial design. So once you select your factorial design, you compare them. There's a way to compare them. Either you compare factor A with factor B or intervention A with intervention B. Then if one works better than the other one, then you select that one. But another aim is if your outcome talks about, let's say you want to look at HIV care engagement. In that process, we cannot use factorial design because that one will not help. So in that approach, then your optimization criteria will be like using adaptative intervention. That's when you want to talk about outcomes like HIV engagement. If you want to talk about depression, how it varies from one person to another person, then you can use the adaptative intervention. And another one is if you want to, based on some decision rules, if I have 2 treatments and um, uh, okay, let me explain. But so if I have,
Sorry, Jonah.
okay, so let's say you have 2 treatments, you want to compare the 2 treatments based on your initial randomization. So if based on some response you expect, if those response does not work, then you try to randomize those that did not respond well. That one comes into smart design. That one comes into smart design, which I'll also talk about in my next slide. So let's say you have optimized everything. The next step is to evaluate your best candidate models. So in order to evaluate it, you usually compare it to the standard randomized controlled trials. So that's where you select the best one, you compare the best candidate with the evaluation with the randomized controlled trial. And that will help you to know whether the one you selected is actually better than the standard one or it's not better than the standard one. So that's the evaluation stage. So basically that's all about most, and I'm going to go deep into the other optimization criterion like the adaptive interventions. So when you talk about adaptive interventions or dynamic treatment regimen, it's just like a personalized one. They are the personalized multi-stage treatment strategies that individualize the type and intensity of support based on a person's baseline characteristics and ongoing processes. So what it means is that based on the feedback you get from the person, then you decide what to do next. If you start and it doesn't go well, then you go back and change the decision. So you adjust it repeatedly over time based on some decisions you need to make. It is not like a fixed term. It's like it doesn't work. It's not like one size fits all intervention. It is based on what the feedback you get at that time and what decision you need to make at that time. So basically, that's a adaptive intervention, and it usually it has four components in every adaptive interventions. You consider four components. The first component you consider is known as the critical decision points. The critical decision points are the moments in the patient's care when a choice must be made, such as when to start a treatment, what to do if the treatment fails, and how to maintain gains after improvement or how to respond to early signs of relapse. So that's the first element of adaptive design. That's when a choice must be made. So if you decide on what should be done, then you move on to the next element, which is known as the intervention options. So for the intervention option, that's at each decision point you take, then you consider possible options. So the intervention options is where you define what could be done at each stage. So at each stage, what should I do? Should I go back? Should I modify it? That comes under the intervention options. So when you decide to know what to do at that stage, then you move on to the tailoring variables. So these are the patient characteristics or the immediate outcome that will signal when a change is needed and which option is the best. They'll often include the early non-response, side effects, burden, contextual factors, and information about what the patient has already received. So based on that, that's where the tailoring variable comes in. So after that, the last step you consider is the decision rule. So for each decision point you make, there should be a rule that will link the tailoring variable to a recommended intervention. And these rules will specify when to modify the treatment and how to adjust it to maximize the long-term outcomes. So those are the four components of adaptive interventions. And then there comes the question, why do you use it? The first reason why we actually use adaptive intervention is for, which I call it personalization. So it delivers the right level of support to the right person at the right time by adjusting the treatment based on the early response you get from the patient. So based on the response you get from the patient, then you know what to do. So that's the first advantage of using adaptive design. And in terms of responsiveness, it allows the treatment to change dynamically. It's not fixed. So since it allows the treatment to be changed dynamically as the patient needs evolve, it actually helps you to know what you should do at that point in time. Then in terms of equity and precision, since we have different individuals responding differently, here it ensures that individuals who need more help or get help, and those who are doing well will just avoid unnecessary burden. So that's why we have the equity and precision. And in terms of real-world fit, what I mean is that it helps clinicians to make the right decision. I mean, it helps them to make the right decision, making sure that they go back, and if it doesn't work, then they have to know what to do at that point in time. They don't just the clinician don't take decision at the baseline and say that, okay, this is the decision we are going to take. It should last forever. No, in adaptive design, based on the feedback we get from the patient, then you go back and revisit your decision, then you take another decision. So that's the adaptive intervention. So this is an example from adaptive intervention design program, which was conducted in 2008 by Mallory for a drug program. So what they did was they had a standard program for a court. So they wanted to develop another program known as the Adaptive Drug Court Program. So here, when a person is, arrested, they have initial screening where they will determine whether the person is at high risk or low risk. So if a person is at high risk, then that person will go bi-weekly court hearings. If they determine that the person is at low risk, then the person will go at the usual hearings. Then every week they will take a sample, like the drug test they do, they will take a sample. Then at the end of the month, they will evaluate them. So those non-compliant, based on whether you are high risk or low risk, they will know where to put you. If you are non-compliant and you fail some of the drug tests more than 2, then they'll put you at the intensive care management program. But if you are low risk and you are compliant, then you continue with the usual court hearing. So after they implemented this design, they found out that those drug offenders, their graduation rate actually increased. I mean, it increased by more than almost 9% of higher graduation rates. And their response in addressing infractions also increased. They had about 88% success rate. And based on this kind of trial, they were asked to actually implement it for a larger trial, and they did that in 2012. And recently, I also found out that they have also increased it. They are now doing it for every 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and the rest. So that's one way where you can, this is an example of adaptive intervention, which has proven to be, effective. The next one I'm going to talk about is the SMART trial. It's the SMART trial. So the SMART trial is experimental design that is used to develop and optimize adaptive interventions. So we have the adaptive intervention, we have the SMART trial. But in terms of SMART trial, what it does is it includes multiple stages of randomization. And each randomization you get will come into a clinical decision point. So in that trial, what they do is at first, you group the participants, you randomize them into your initial treatment. And based on some kind of threshold you select, you use that one to treat them whether they are respondents or non-respondents. So those non-respondents will be randomized into a different stage. Then, so in so doing, you are able to select the best sequence of intervention that is best for the different types of patients. And there are designs that are intended to build high quality adaptive intervention. And one thing we should also notice that SMART designs are not actually confirmatory trials. In order to confirm it, you have to test it with the RCT at the final stage. Okay. So some people also get confused with whether in adaptive design, do we randomize or we don't randomize? The thing is that we use SMART design to develop and optimize adaptive interventions. So in so doing, within the SMART design aspect, that's where you use your randomization. So you can do re-randomization during the SMART aspect, or we call it the research phase. So at the research phase, that's where you use the SMART design. But at the final stage, we have the adaptive intervention. So at that point, we don't randomize because that randomization has already been occurred during the research phase. And that's where we use the SMART design. So in adaptive design, we don't randomize because that's the final stage. But the research stage is the smart design where you can do your randomization. And this is an example of smart design. So this is a paper in 2025 where their aim was to use smart design to see whether there's improvement for insulin sensitivity in patients with stage 1 obesity. So here they had about 30 patients where they grouped them into two groups based on their stage 1 obesity. So first they randomized them into two groups like nutrition counseling and exercise counseling. And they wanted to monitor them from week 1 to week 8, that's 8 weeks. Then after 8 weeks, they will take a decision. So after 8 weeks, those patients in the nutritional group, they will go back and check their insulin level. So if your insulin level improved by 5%, then you are going to continue with the nutrition counseling. But if your insulin level is less or equals to 5%, then they are going to randomize you. That's the second stage of the randomization. So in that part, either they are going to augment you with metformin, or they will switch you to weight loss counseling. And in the same way that they did to exercise counseling. So if you are in exercise counseling and your response rate is more than 5%, you continue with the normal exercise counseling. But if your response rate is less or equals to 5%, then they are going to randomize you and add metformin to your exercise counseling, or they will just switch you to weight loss counseling. So that was their procedure. And at the end of the 25 weeks, they will collect their data and reassess whether it was effective or not effective. So the initial results shows that there was a largest gain in the insulin level by those who were actually responded. And for those non-respondents, they recommended that they go back to use the weight counseling aspect or they use the metformin aspect. But when you compare the two, there was a larger gain in those who actually responded. So that's one example of smart design you can implement.
So now we have a few minutes. We can talk about some of the special considerations that we think about in these kinds of designs and as implementation scientists. And certainly we think about how we think about power calculations to understand our effect size. We think about fidelity a lot because the different kind of trial designs are impactful in whether we care about fidelity or not. And then we also think about implementation strategy specification, and then there's a lot to consider with regard to logistics and operationalizing these kinds of trials when you're thinking about implementation strategies. So I think at this point, I want to have a little bit of time to consider questions from the audience and also to, so I'm just curious if these are some of the considerations that you all are thinking about it. And Felice, I can't see the chat. I don't know if you notice any other considerations in the chat that might change this list.
I am not seeing anything in the chat right now. If folks
Okay.
have something, please put it in chat or come off mute. No.
Okay. So, Jonah can talk a little bit about power, and I'll hand it back over to you, Jonah, to think about to discuss some of the things that are important when thinking about power.
All right. So for every study design, what usually comes to our mind is our sample size, And in order to determine the right sample size, you need power. So that power helps you to determine the right sample size. And one reason why you need power is sometimes if you have low power, let me put it that way. So if you have low power in your research, what you are bound to have is what's known as a false negative. In other words, if your study doesn't have enough participants or clusters to detect a meaningful effect, you are likely going to conclude that, I mean, your strategy doesn't work when in reality it actually works. And when that happens, I mean, it becomes like you wasted your effort, you wasted your funding, and I mean, there's delay in everything. So that's one aspect of power that we need to consider. When you have underpower, it always produces false negative, wasted resources, and delayed progresses. And sometimes too, if you assume that you need high power, then there's also likely that you are going to recruit more people because you want to have more power, you're going to recruit more people. And if you're going to recruit more people, it means you are going to spend more. You are going to spend more. It's going to take more time and other stuff. So what happens? There should be a balance between the underpower and overpower. There should be in between. It should be in between where you can actually determine the right power you need to use. And 2024, Williams and Co. came out with different approaches of selecting the right power. They suggested these kind of guidelines that first, when you are doing your power analysis, you need to consider the effect size, which usually is between 0 to 0.2 to 0.6. When you go higher, it actually affects your results. And you also need to consider your interclass correlation coefficient, which should be between 0.05 and 0.2. Then you need to also consider the covariate you are going to use. We know that the covariate is also an important aspect of when you're considering your power. And lastly, they suggested that we need to consider the design effect, which depends on the average cluster size. But to calculate power, it takes time. But there have been several software we can use both in R and I mean SAS. All other programs have a way of calculating power. You don't need to do it manually. Also, our own firm here, BED, has a way of helping people who want to calculate the sample size and I mean with the power and analysis. So if you are into sample size calculation and you don't have any idea how to do this, I would suggest that you look at the BED as the department we have here. They will help you to calculate, I mean, the right sample size. And if you need more other help too, we are here to also help you. So don't forget that power is part of it's like the main thing you need to consider when you're actually considering your sample size. Thank you.
Just a word on fidelity. So this is probably the most contentious thing that we might consider. I think whether we're concerned about fidelity, it really kind of depends. And when I think about that, I think about those different buckets of trials that we were thinking about. So particularly for pragmatic trials, there's less emphasis on fidelity. We're really interested in what happens in the real world. And so while we potentially might measure fidelity, we're not interested in optimizing fidelity. However, we might be interested in what adaptations people in the real world make to the intervention, and we might consider core components of an intervention and what might be non-core components of the intervention. And we typically think about trying to preserve the core components of the intervention and identifying those things that it doesn't really matter if you change them. Like if you change the color of the brochure, does it matter? Probably not. And so those are some of the things we're always thinking about in these types of trials. On the other hand, those other buckets of trials, when we're trying to think about implementation strategy effectiveness and optimization, it's really vital that we consider the fidelity of the actual implementation strategy. So there's a big push in implementation science to make sure that people are naming the implementation strategies, defining it, and then specifying how they actually work and the mechanisms behind that. There are lots of trials on audit and feedback. The results are all over the map, whether it's effective or not. And partly it's because people are doing different things when they're saying they're doing audit and feedback. And so because we haven't really defined and looked at the fidelity of how we're doing the implementation strategy, it's hard to understand whether audit and feedback works. This is, again, a push particularly from NHLBI to really understand how implementation strategies work and the mechanisms behind them. And so fidelity to these kinds of approaches are important. A couple of things in terms of operationalizing these kinds of trials. Budget. Even, today there are people who forget to include implementation FTE, like the people who actually implement or do the implementation strategies in the trials and to understand what the cost of the implementation is. An issue we think about often is consent. For example, do we need patient level consent when we're studying established, proven, evidence-based practices? I think that happened early on in my career. We had a lot of consternation about that, worked through with IRBs to think about it. And generally, we think that, if you're offering standard of care, then you don't really need, and you're measuring outcomes, at a practice level. You don't necessarily need individual patient level consent, but could be open for discussion depending on the specifics of the trial. Another issue we often think about is safety. Again, if we're offering something that's established, proven, evidence-based practices and just studying the implementation strategies of how we get docs to do those evidence-based practices, do we need to monitor safety when it's already been shown to be a safe practice? And so the questions about how we look at adverse events might change as well. Lots of questions around data collection and how we can potentially use existing clinical data to measure outcomes instead of reinventing the wheel with data collection. Felice, any questions that you might want to answer right now before we start thinking about resources?
I don't see any questions in the chat right now. If you do, please go come off mute or share. I'm going to go quickly, just to tell you a little bit about who we are. I'll put our information for our website and our email in chat. The Dissemination and Implementation Launchpad is a core within ICTR. The goal is to address barriers and accelerate impact of health-related innovations. Next slide. We have a core team of Dr. Ellis as our director, and then myself and 2 other staff, as well as our academic advisory council. Next slide. And the crux of what we do, we provide consultations, training, collaboration, funding to folks who are interested in integrating dissemination and implementation science into their work. And so we consult and support projects across the university, and we would love to talk to you all about implementation projects you're working on or trials that you're considering. Next slide. If you want to learn more, as I mentioned, this is our website and our email. Next slide. Also, we often partner with our Bird Consulting Corps, and so I just wanted to give a shout out to them as another excellent resource in trial design and implementation science trial design specifically. And then I have the slide with additional resources. So into the hybrid designs as mentioned by Dr. Ellis, as well as the PRISIs, and then the most and smart designs mentioned by Jonah, and a couple of other opportunities to get more information about clinical trials. So a course that is offered, and we are working on a short course for 2027 around advanced clinical trials for optimizing implementation strategies. And if folks are interested, excited about it, please reach out. We're working to find collaborators to help develop that short course. Thank you. Okay, we are now at the end of time, so thank you so much.
Thank you very much, all 3 speakers. Really appreciate this. We'll have to have you come back. This was just a lot of terrific information. I think people could stand to hear it more than a couple times. This is awesome. Thank you again. And thanks to the
Thank you very
participants.
much.